Okay, I would encourage you to take a seat. We are going to start. Okay, welcome everyone to the side event on climate action in financial institutions. My name is Benoît Leguet. I'm the managing director of I4CE, the Institute for Climate Economics. I4CE is a think tank on the economics of climate change, and we have the pleasure to act as the secretariat of the Climate Action in Financial Institutions initiative. So I would like, before we set out, I would like to thank the co-organizers, the EIB, the European Investment Bank, and CAF, Corporación, Andina, and Fomento. I would also like to thank the UNFCCC for giving us the opportunity to host this side event, and the bingos for also providing this opportunity. So today we'll have, can we pass on to, yeah, thanks. Today we have an agenda which is quite heavy. We'll have first an introduction by Felix Burgel with CAF. We'll have a panel discussion after this keynote address, and the different panelists are sitting next to me. They will talk about the challenges ahead for the systematic integration of climate change within their institutions. And we'll have a conclusion by Monica Catasta with the European Investment Bank. So without further ado, I would like to call Felix to give his keynote. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon. The Climate Action in Financial Institutions was launched in 2015 by more than 20 institutions to build and share some common principles and to help the countries in achieving the global objectives of the Paris Agreement. CAF is very proud to have been one of the charter members of this initiative. Countries around the world face the challenge of equipping their economies and societies for low-carbon, resilient policies to avoid locking into unsustainable development patterns. And the private sector faces the challenge of incorporating climate change risks into decision-making processes and harnessing the opportunities of low-carbon, resilient development. Financial institutions play a key role in addressing the challenges of a global low-carbon and resilient development, internally and through the relationship with their clients. The 5 voluntary principles of mainstreaming climate action within financial institutions: commit, manage, promote, improve, and account, provide a statement of leadership and a framework for collaboration and exchange of lessons learned. Mainstreaming, by definition, implies a shift from randomly financing climate activities to making climate change a core consideration and a lens through which institutions deploy capital. The initiative aims to provide an opportunity for financial institutions to learn from each other, ensure lessons learned around good practices are disseminated, and support the development of new approaches. Today, 30 institutions around the globe have joined the initiative and adopted the 5 voluntary principles for climate mainstreaming. Through this initiative, high-level representatives of member financial institutions are sharing their views on how to initiate the initiative can aid the implementation of the Paris Agreement. By contributing to design and implement low-carbon, resilient policies and business models that support climate change mitigation and adaptation while preparing for accompanying changes, and by integrating different economic actors into new development models and providing incentives and opportunities for them to engage. Also by managing climate change risks and uncertainties and generating climate-smart opportunities. And finally, by prioritizing initiatives needed to achieve development and reach the sustainable goals and meet fiduciary responsibilities. Since 2015, the financial institutions have started to bring responses and efforts as illustrated by the example and case studies presented in the Emerging Practices paper published with the help of the Mainstreaming Initiatives Secretariat. Most of us have undertaken efforts to incorporate climate change considerations in our operations. And the tools and methodologies developed by some supporting institutions are very innovative solutions. This is the purpose of the mainstreaming initiative, to share those efforts between the different supporting institutions and also with all the public and private organizations involved in low carbon and resilient development. For the 2017 to 2018 period, supporting institutions have decided to organize their efforts in the framework of 4 work streams: climate risks, mapping reporting initiatives and understanding implementation challenges, city-level climate smart approaches and financial instruments, and spreading a climate strategy into the whole organization. CAF has steadily placed climate change as a key component of its corporate strategy. From 2014 to 2016, the organization worked on the establishment of a climate change unit that is dedicated to developing mitigation and adaptation activities, as well as to raising awareness amongst internal and external stakeholders. Around the same time, a sustainable strategy was adopted upon the following principles: promoting the conservation of natural capital, facilitating migration towards a low carbon and climate resilient economy with social inclusion and equal opportunities. And by playing a pivotal role in promoting sustainable growth models under the principles of a green economy and investing in capital and green infrastructure in the region. For example, we promote environmental management aligned with the required productive transformation to move towards low carbon economies. We incorporate environmental criteria in operations and finance investments in Latin America through an integrated approach to sustainability that incorporates economic, social, and environmental aspects. In the last 5 years, in more than 25 of the region's cities, CAF has carried out specific actions through financing, technical cooperation, and public-private associations within the framework of its Cities with a Future initiative, whose objectives is the sustainable development of urban areas. Since 2014, CAF has been accredited under the main UN financial mechanisms to address climate change issues: the Adaptation Fund, the Global Environment Fund, and the Green Climate Fund. Also, is an active member of the International Development Finance Club, IDFC, and CAF has participated in the definition and promotion of the common principles for tracking climate finance. According to this methodology, 25% of CAF's current portfolio is dedicated to green projects over the past 2 years in the areas of adaptation and mitigation. To conclude, we're pleased to inform about the launch of the online emerging practice searchable database. The database, developed with the help of the Mainstreaming Initiative Secretariat, will be a tool for supporting institutions as well as for the broader financial and business community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felix. I would like now to turn to the panel for addressing the challenges ahead for integrating climate change within the financial institutions. So the speaking order will be as follows. We'll have Damien Navizet, who's the head of climate division at the Agence Française de Développement. Then we'll have Terry McCallion. He's the director of energy efficiency and climate change at the EBRD. Stuart James is the managing director of government affairs at HSBC. We'll have a read statement from Namita Vikas, who's the group president and global head, climate strategy and responsible banking at Yes Bank. Namita was not able to be here, but she sent a few words that we'd like to share today. We'll also have Pa Ousmane Georgiou, who is the director of country programming division at the Green Climate Fund, and Gaia Lawson, who's a senior associate climate finance with the World Resources Institute. So, Damien, if I may turn to you, a question to you. What has AFD been doing to take climate out of the climate division that you head?
Merci, Benoît. I'm delighted to be with you today to speak about this initiative and the fact that mainstreaming climate change into operations is a process which brings lots of benefits. And you are correct, one of the stakes is to actually mainstream in the way that it goes in into every bit of the structure of our institution. So just a quick word on the AFD. We are the French Development Agency, and so we are the French Bilateral Development Bank. And so we operate in 80 or so countries across the developing world, financing mostly infrastructure projects. I thought that to answer your question, I should quickly scroll down the five principles of the initiative. I think it's a nice structure to try to sketch the landscape. First, the climate change strategy. In fact, we've had one since 2005 at the AFD, and we've had a second one in 2011, and the third one is coming up this month to be presented to the board. And each time we would renew the strategy, we could see the progress that was being made. It started out as really an operational strategy, trying to support operations. And then the second one became a much more structuring tool with big institutional objectives. I'll come to that later. And the third one today, we can see that it's not only about operations anymore. In the strategy, you'll find objectives and action plans that target really the risk department, the research department, the partnership department. So it's not only about operations. And my team is within the operations department of the bank, if you like, but I will soon probably end up trying to coordinate people broadly across the institution, and I think that's really something to be said. I should add that we've grown 10 times over the last 15 years, and I think that much of this growth was made possible because we embarked on financing climate change. And then, when COP21 came along, there was additional resources, and we grew again. So, completely satisfied by that. The second principle is climate smart objectives. So currently we have something that is already, I guess, very structuring for our operations. The objective is that 50%, so half of our yearly finance, is dedicated to projects with climate co-benefits, either mitigation co-benefits or adaptation co-benefits. It's a remarkable objective, but at the same time, we are a development bank, and so we can't really decide that we'll go 70-80% climate co-benefits. We still have to finance health, education, and plenty of other projects for which climate change can be taken into account, but it's not really the primary objective. And we will go further with the new strategy. I'm sure Benoît will want to know more. The third principle is about climate performance, and I think the best example I could tell you about is that when we started the strategy back in 2005, we decided to start calculating the carbon footprint of the project we would finance. It's really a messy exercise. It's ex ante, the project doesn't exist, you have to make all kinds of hypotheses. But it really brought a lot of new perspectives on the projects. And I would say that the primary function of this carbon footprint is really to know where we are going and what we are committing ourselves to. Of course, in some instances, the carbon footprint showed us that it was going to be a nice project with CO2 avoided, and it was okay. And then in other instances, it would show us how brown or gray project could be. And it allowed us at one stage to say, okay, we will never, ever again finance projects that are highly emissive, for example. And one type of such project, of course, is coal power plants. So we were able to use this climate performance not really to set standards, but really to know exactly where we were heading. The fourth principle is about managing climate risks. And so we applied, once again, firstly to the operations, trying to see how vulnerable, for example, the project might be against the price of oil, for example, or against adverse effect of climate change. And then today, the whole concept of climate risks are really exploded, I would say, and it's coming out of the operations. It's about maybe in the coming months or years, climate stress testing. It's about trying to define what's our global exposure to climate change can be as a bank. And I must say that all the things we've put in place, like carbon footprinting, and these are the tools, are in fact already, without knowing it, they were building blocks of a climate risk management strategy. Lastly, reporting, maybe the most important one. Of course, we now report every year for the last 10 years about the climate finance we deliver. So it's yearly approvals for mitigation, adaptation. We slice and dice according to countries and sectors. And I think this has also brought us little by little to be more and more transparent. And we're not quite there yet. I think there's always progress that can be made in terms of transparency. And perhaps as a hint to what's going to follow, financing using half of our finance to finance climate co-benefit is a nice story, and you might wonder what we're doing with the other 50%. But this is the suspense, and I should not be telling it right now.
Okay, since you prodded me into asking you a question, okay, what exactly does that mean? I mean, we've read that the AFD committed to align 100% of its activities with the Paris Agreement. What does that mean?
Well, it's not official yet, so you should feel all privileged. But the climate plan of the French government, which was released in July, decided that the AFD would have explicitly the mandate of implementing the Paris Agreement. And it was okay, because for some time we had been really applying our minds on what should we be doing about the rest of the portfolio that doesn't have climate co-benefits clearly. What are we doing with the other 50%? And so the idea emerged that to the very least, we should be able to report that 100% of our finance is at least consistent with long-term climate transition or consistent with the Paris Agreement. And what does that mean? That's the second half of the question. It means really thinking differently about the projects and climate change. It means recognizing that as a development bank, our mandate is not to finance CO2 reductions, not only. It's really to finance sustainable development and long-term sustainable development. And I'd like to invite you to turn again to the Paris Agreement. That really says that. The third objective is making finance flows, and I think that's us, compatible with long-term pathways that are low carbon and resilient. And it also says that the finance we provide should be supporting country-driven strategies and long-term planning. And the decision of Paris invites all countries to try and build mid-century low-carbon development pathways. And so what it's going to mean in very concrete terms is that for every project in a given country, this country-specific context is going to be our guideline, trying to see what the country has set itself as a long-term low-carbon trajectory. In some instances, it's going to be harder than others, I guess. And then try to see if the project that is proposed to us is consistent, is neutral, if you like, or sometimes may go in the wrong direction. And the whole idea is to try and prevent ourselves from financing the projects that would be going clearly against the long-term transition.
Right, thanks, Damien. Turning now to Terry. Terry, the EBRD has been quite active on climate for a number of years. What lessons are you willing to share with other financial institutions?
All of them, of course. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here, and I'm very, very pleased to be a part of the discussion on fundamentally, how do we get banks playing the role in this area of climate change that we're all so committed to? I think I'll talk a little bit about why I think banks are important, and by extension from that, why the 5 principles of the mainstreaming initiative are important. I think it's important because it provides a distribution capacity. Banks, I work for a bank. It's just a development bank. We sit in London, we're very far away from our clients, but we're important. Just like AFD, we've got a strategy in this space. We also work very, very closely with financial institutions. We finance banks to deliver green financing. And I think this is incredibly important just to get distribution capacity. By definition, energy efficiency and resource efficiency is something that happens in the real economy. It's something that, whether the people in this room work for a private sector company or whether you live in a house or an office, it's something that we absolutely all have to think about. How do we play the individual roles in terms of mitigating climate change? Let's not talk about resilience just yet. So what do we need? We need to know what investments to make. We need access to funding. We probably need access to information. And I think banks, whether they're development banks like ourselves or commercial banks with a network of offices and branches and a suite of loan officers who handle the relationships with people and companies, are incredibly important in order to provide that funding and to provide information actually on what it is that people can invest in that aren't just good for the environment but are probably good business investment decisions as well. Now, what I know from our own point of view, and for those of you that don't know, the EBRD was the institution that was set up after the collapse of communism. It had an initial fundamental role in helping with the transition from communism to a market economy. Climate wasn't necessarily something that existed at the origins of the EBRD, but the EBRD has had an energy efficiency financing team since 1994. A bank that has had a group of people looking at financing energy efficiency. This was because of the nature of the economies that we started to do business in. Energy wasn't priced properly, resources weren't priced properly, the environment wasn't protected properly. So, in some ways it was obvious that the EBRD should have an energy efficiency financing team. Coming out of that, I would say that from that point of view, it's really important that when you deal with a client as a borrower, that you put someone in the room who understands their business. This is something that we've found. I mean, it's not, you can have a banker in the room with a steel company, but if you've got someone in the room who understands how a steel company works, where its expenses are, what percentage of its expenses are in something like energy, and what technologies can be implemented, and what the internal rate of return of those investments are. This is really what gets investment decisions made, and it's what helps to get limited capital to the priority investments. So I would say that loans, and let's call them green economy loans, that's kind of the language we use at the bank, they make good business. They improve the cash flow of the underlying borrowers. Okay, it turns out that they save CO2, they reduce water consumption, they optimize the use of materials. But they also have, an internal rate of return of maybe 50, 60%. When I look at the case studies of the things that we finance, money talks, and these things save money and reduce CO2 emissions. So it's good business, and that's why I think that a focused approach on getting more and more banks signed up and adopting a strategy and adopting these principles is very, very important. It's been a good business for us. Just the work that we do with financial institutions alone, we now work with 130 commercial banks across about 30 countries, where we provide bank-to-bank funding, but we help them develop products for on-lending for energy efficiency, resource efficiency, and renewable energy. This works. We do about €500 million of investment a year. Through that distribution capacity, we've managed to reach something like 120,000 enterprises. This saves probably about 10 million tons of CO2 a year, and yet it's still all sound banking and good sort of business practice to invest in these things. So that all sounds, really rosy, but it's not easy. You have to have a focus, you have to have a strategy, you have to do something different if you're a bank and you want to finance the low carbon transition somehow. if you want to unlock all of that value. And I think this is why the 5 principles are very important. You know, they're not exactly the same as the way we at the EBRD went about it, but, you know, we started very, very early and we had other drivers, right? Not necessarily climate initially. Climate became the key focus of what we do. It became the business model that we apply. And the business model that we've used works. I mean, we've gone since the early days from having a few % of our business in things like energy efficiency and climate change mitigation to about routinely 30% of our business, and that's around about €3 billion a year. Before the Paris Agreement, we committed to scale up to 40% by 2020, and we're on track to do that. We're actually, we're there already, but, you know, I don't think it's a slam dunk yet. You know, we have to keep innovating and developing new products so that we can consistently keep 40% of our business at that level. But just like when I talked earlier about the value of having a banker in the room that understands the sector, I think this is all very, very much about the value and how you unlock the value. It has to be interesting for banks, it has to be interesting for companies to invest, and you have to sort of create value. I mean, one of the values for me, you know, for those of you that don't recognize my accent, it became a little bit embarrassing for me to go home to Ireland and tell people I was a banker after the crisis in 2008. So I sort of adopted a new persona. I now tell people I work in climate finance, and this turns out, I think, for all the banks in the room and the banks signing up to this initiative, you know, they can get out of an embarrassing situation of calling themselves bankers by saying they work in climate finance. But I think it's very, very much about value related. That's just a funny thing. That's the side value to me. It has to be of sort of good business potential, as well as finding a way to get money to things like energy efficiency that save energy and reduce CO2 emissions. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Terry, and thanks for underlining the value of engaging on green finance, both at the corporate and the personal level. I understand. Turning to Stuart. Stuart, HSBC has been involved in a number of international discussions on climate change, on climate and, I would say, green finance in broad sense. How have those international discussions informed your approach to mainstreaming climate change? And if I may, ask you, especially in facilitating access to finance for local actors and or subnational, let's say, cities, for example.
Thank you very much, and pleasure to be with you all. In terms of the journey that HSBC is on, it's in many ways very similar to what we've heard from Damien and Terry. The one thing I'd add to that in particular that I think any large organization needs is real leadership from the top, from the CEO. Our CEO, Stuart Gulliver, I think got religion on this a few years ago, and roughly around the time of COP21. And I think it was the targets and the fact that there was a political agreement to actually really do something that made him realize that if that was to be achieved, then private sector actors needed to be a huge part of that solution, and it was going to have a profound impact on our business. So that leadership from the top is extremely important. Then I think before you can really mainstream something, you need to seize it in the corporate center, if you like, and really work out what it means for you. And that's where I think you know, we were involved in a number of international policy discussions, if you like, to try and better understand what this was going to mean for our business, and then to be able to articulate that within the organization, whether it be about climate disclosure or developing metrics and an understanding of the risk that we face with the assets on our books, if these assets are heavily tied to carbon, etc. But also the positive side of that, to start thinking about, well, what are the new energy sources, and how can we get our business people beginning to develop business lines that are going to be sustainable in the future and moving away from what they've done traditionally. So we set up this year to mark that central push a sustainable finance function. And that has, in true bureaucratic design and fashion, got a number of satellite efforts in the kind of key geographies that HSBC has. For those who don't know, HSBC's in roughly 70 countries across the world, and you know, we have a 250,000 employees. So actually getting them to understand what this means for them is no small task. But having set up that, the next thing that you do, I think, in a financial institution in particular, is you put targets in the scorecards of all your senior business managers. The managers of your global business lines are then assessed and appraised at the end of every year on the extent to which they have achieved a set of goals that are related to making HSBC's business more sustainable. And we have started that process, and it will move inevitably from being relatively qualitative as we try and grapple with the issue to much more quantitative targets that our senior managers will be asked to meet. Then you roll it out, and rolling it out involves training. Most banks like mine have relationship managers for all their key large clients. All these relationship managers need to understand what this means for the business, to be able to articulate to these clients where HSBC as a financing institution is going, the risks we will not take anymore, the kind of investments we do want to look for in the future, and to try and help the clients come along on that journey, because you don't just want to throw them overboard and abandon them unless they really don't get it. So there's training all our relationship managers, really understanding risk, climate-related risk, and how to go about what a roadmap is for decreasing that exposure in a sensible way. We need to think about our own disclosure publicly to all our investors, and so that the broader community of stakeholders knows what we are doing and how we are changing as an organisation. And we've been working with the task force that Bloomberg and Mark Carney set up to try and define how that should look. And of course, we need to actually look for business developments in areas like renewables, etc., where, as I say, our business people are actually thinking very positively about this and trying to create opportunity. Now, this has been a bumper week for us, as it were, because we chose, as a result of all that sort of bureaucratic process I've just described, to try and get the organisation moving. We've defined, if you like, a set of targets for us this week, which you know, we timed that with COP in mind, and some of you may have seen it. So we have now committed to $100 billion worth of sustainable finance and investment by 2025. 100% of HSBC's own electricity usage will be derived from renewables by 2030. And that's not just a sort of dry thing about you know, measuring where we get our energy from. It actually means in some markets that we'll be working with the authorities and the markets in these countries to help them actually create markets in renewables so that we can meet our commitments. It means discontinuing, third, financing of new thermal coal mines and also coal-fired power stations in developed countries. And fourth, we are going to fully implement and be at the vanguard of the disclosure work, the task force on climate-related disclosure. And we really want to be, if you like, a leader in defining what is useful disclosure for the investor community and the broader stakeholding community out there. And also what we need, and we can maybe come on to this a little bit later, from our clients in order that the bank's disclosure can actually be meaningful. So there's a big job of work to be done there. France is leading the road, of course, leading the way in this in many ways with Article 173, and we may see, certainly I'm sure, requests or proposals for Europe to follow suit. But there's quite a lot of learning to do in the detail there in defining metrics. And finally, we've set up, this is our fifth commitment, a centre of sustainable finance, which aims to actually be at the sort of bow wave of knowledge creation in many of the public policy debates that surround this agenda. We've mentioned disclosure, but also blended finance. How do public sector balance sheets and private sector balance sheets be put together, sharing appropriate risks so that we can actually generate the huge volumes of finance that are needed if this transition to a low-carbon economy is to be successful. What does a green centre, a green finance centre look like? How can you develop a language of markets that's about sustainability and green in the way that we understand that markets have a language of credit risk at the moment? All that needs to be worked through so that we can actually put finance and the money that institutional investors and sovereign wealth funds have in the markets. We can put that to the aid of this huge transition, and it doesn't sit on the sidelines. So that's what we're about at the moment.
Okay, and since we're getting closer to Christmas, what would you need from your clients in terms of disclosure to support your mainstreaming activities?
You know, there's not a simple answer to that. The first thing we need from them probably is a commitment to implement themselves the recommendations of the task force on climate disclosure, particularly if they are, you know, a heavy carbon intensive industry or in the power sector, etc. We need them to get on board and make meaningful disclosure so that we can judge where we are relative to them in terms of our own risks. We also want to work with the TCFD Secretariat. At the moment, there will be sort of rather siloed sectoral approaches to thinking through how to disclose meaningfully. So we need to tie these siloed approaches together so that the finance industry is learning from, but also, you know, telling the other sectors how it's going about this exercise and understanding the technical side and nature of the exercise. So two things: one, commitment, and then two, through the TCFD, to actually join up and understand how each other are approaching this.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. For the next 5 minutes or so, I'll be speaking in the name of Namita Vikas with Yes Bank because she couldn't make it to the COP. So please, well, it's not me speaking, then again, it's Namita. Yes Bank, India's 5th largest private sector bank, is the outcome of the professional and entrepreneurial commitment of its founder, Rana Kapoor, and its top management team to establish a high-quality, customer-centric, service-driven, responsible Indian bank catering to the future businesses of India. Yes Bank has been playing a pioneering role in creating an inclusive and resilient financial system in the Indian banking sector. Becoming a supporting institution to the Climate Action in Financial Institutions initiatives seemed like a natural fit for Yes Bank, which has been actively involved in the initiative right since its inception in 2015. Climate change is real and is affecting businesses across the globe. Strategically responding to the opportunities presented is extremely critical for ensuring healthy business bottom lines and creating a shared value for the environment and communities. The principles for mainstreaming climate action serve as voluntary, non-binding and aspirational guidelines for financial institutions like Yes Bank to move further in adapting to climate change and promoting climate-smart development. The principles would certainly move the needle in the right direction by steering a global action to level the playing field. So with that was her statement. On the side, I would like to thank Yes Bank for submitting 4 case studies to feed into the database. And on the side, Yes Bank is also noticeable because it's a private bank, and it's a private bank from a developing and or emerging country. We thank Namita for her input, and I can turn now to Pa Usman. So, Pa Usman, what is your view on the 5 principles? The GCF is not a member of the initiative, but you're present at this panel. So what is your view on the principles?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. The GCF sees these 5 principles as a very important initiative to help the financial community learn from each other and also to move mainstream climate change. And committing to climate strategies, we think financial sector actors would have to show their commitment to climate strategies by developing their own policy instruments, and this can be done with the support of central bank and financial regulatory authorities. They can show such commitment by investigating and investing in low-emission climate-resilient business deals. We know that unless financial institutions have enough business of this nature to invest in, they will continue to be going on the business-as-usual pathway. In terms of managing climate risk, the financial institutions need to manage climate risks more rigorously because climate risks are increasing, becoming operational risk for both financial institutions themselves and their clients. Recent studies on the impacts of climate change on financial stability indicate that the importance to identify, disclose, and manage such risk, and we expect such requirements would be progressively scaled up to be integral part of the regulatory frameworks of the entire financial system. In terms of promoting climate-smart objectives, we think this can be promoted by sharing experiences and best practices between financial institutions. There is a lot to learn from the financial institutions in countries such as Bangladesh, China, Indonesia, Mongolia, to just inspire others to follow up their footsteps. In improving climate performance, we think we need to have management systems that would further improve and enable deeper monitoring of the progress achieved and also better understand what still needs to be done. With such developments, we can expect climate performance to be more operational, and the organizational performance of the financial institutions can be guided and would be very useful for the corporate clients. And finally, in order to account for your climate action, all actors, including financial institutions, need to develop a culture of accountability to self-assessment and also accountability assessment by the tiers. So when it comes to climate action, we should all be able to track and monitor our greenhouse gas footprints of our own and also that of our clients. And we should ensure that the climate change becomes a key part of what we do in our business endeavors.
Okay, thanks, Pat Usman. Question to you. Does the GCF intend to engage with accredited entities or already engages with accredited entities to make sure that climate change is actually becoming part of how they do business? And if so, how?
Yes, we do engage with accredited entities, and the GCF is committed to help the operations of individual financial institutions through their accreditation process and development of projects that support a paradigm shift to low-emission, climate-resilient development pathway. And in the GCF accreditation process itself, the initial step is supporting the financial institutions to become effective enabler of an irreversible and growing low-emission and climate-resilient real economy, as the accreditation process requires them as candidates to develop and implement a robust environmental and social safeguards, including gender policies at both institutional level and also at project level. This requirement is cascaded to be applied to beneficiary financial institutions as part of the program financed through the international accredited entities such as the EBRD and CEF, Sustainable Energy Financial Facilities. For example, many of the financial institutions did not have gender policy at the project level in place, but we had to develop and implement it to comply with, they had to develop and implement it to comply with our requirements. And as you know, women in developing countries are the most vulnerable, and they also are affected by the impacts of climate change. The GCF strives to push for developing and helping underprivileged women get better access to finance in their countries. One example is the ZAC Bank from Mongolia. When they submitted an energy efficiency program to the GCF last year, we restructured their program by incentivizing the ZAC Bank to provide better financial terms to women-led medium and small-scale enterprises compared to the male-led counterparts. So the bottom line is that the GCF does not approve proposals that do not have a very clear linkage to climate change and sustainability. So this is how we work with the entities.
All right, thank you, Postman. Turning now to Gaia. Gaia, the WRI has been working on mainstreaming climate finance within financial institutions for a number of years. Any lesson you would like to share with the audience and with the panel, possibly, as to how institutions can help support not only climate action, but the broader transition to a low-carbon and climate-resilient economy?
Yes. Thank you very much. My name is Gaia Larson. I'm from the World Resources Institute. And we have been engaging on this issue for a while. I was actually just looking at a report with a title, something along the lines of Mainstreaming Climate Action at MDBs, and it was from 2005. So we are very happy to see that this is continued, this conversation is growing and now has gotten real momentum, I think, compared to 10 years ago or 12, whenever that was written. And really, mainstreaming is, I think, now the issue that we need to think about. If by mainstreaming we mean, making essentially all financial flows somehow align with our global goals, which, as was mentioned before by the AFD. A lot of focus has been paid so far on, at least within the context of the UNFCCC, which is where we sit, on how do we account for climate finance? What is climate finance? How do we track it? How do we make it comparable with our, and that is very important, clearly, and we need to be able to continue and to make sure that everyone is on the same page when we talk about climate finance. But at the same time, climate finance can't be the focus in itself if by climate finance we mean things that are specifically focused on, for example, solar or wind. We also need to be looking at the rest of the portfolio. And the Paris Agreement actually did recognize this in Article 2.1c, where it spoke about how all financial flows really need to be aligned with our low carbon and climate resilient future. And so what we're thinking about right now at WRI a lot is how do you count that? What metrics do you use? What methodologies? Because clearly there are actions you can take to help mainstream, and I think the principals do a good job in catching sort of the general actions. On the one hand, targets, on the other hand, kind of minimum standards, and sort of they can help you move in the general direction. But how do you monitor that and measure that and compare between institutions? And so I think there's several different kind of strands of work right now where people are trying to get at this question, and it hasn't been solved yet, for sure. And one of them is the net climate finance conversation that the RMI, the Rocky Mountain Institute, was part of starting, which talks about, okay, so you have climate finance, but then what about fossil fuel finance? So their methodology there is essentially to subtract the fossil fuel finance from the climate finance and see what your net finance is in general, which is an interesting approach. Other approaches, something that WRI is quite involved with together with the UN Global Compact, is the science-based targets. So far it has been focused largely on corporates in terms of, for example, businesses like Mars and IKEA, but these companies, it's moving more now into the financial sector, helping institutions look at not just how do you track, for example, greenhouse gas emissions for your entities, but how do you track and then set targets based on what the science projects over the next, however many years, relative to your sector and the amount of sort of activity that you have within your sector. So it's a different way, again, of approaching this question of how do you account for your impact overall. And then within my team at WRI, we've also looked at, or started to try to look at the portfolios of, starting first with the multilateral banks, and thinking how do you look at a portfolio and say if something is aligned or not. Clearly, it's easy for some things, like solar power or wind power is generally thumbs up, that looks good. Coal, generally, in most cases, not going to be aligned with a low carbon future. But then, if you look at most banks' portfolios, there's a really big gap in the middle with lots of things that aren't either solar or coal. And that includes particularly things like transmission and distribution systems for energy, or in some cases, natural gas, for example. These cases where it really, it depends on the circumstances as to whether this is something that it's supporting a shift towards a more, low carbon sustainable future or not. So what are the metrics there and how do we develop that? So right now, actually, we are about to start to bring together experts looking specifically at the transmission and distribution question to see if it is possible to develop metrics there where you can kind of look at what would you look at when you look at those projects to see if they're aligning, because you know, an electrical wire can carry any kind of electricity. But what are the things that need to be put in place to make sure that this is not locking in the wrong kind of energy going forward? So these are just some of, I think, the initiatives that are trying to tackle that question of how do you monitor the bigger impact of a portfolio, but as I said, we haven't found the answers yet, and so I think it would be actually really interesting if this initiative could continue to explore that question. You know, a lot of the people that are engaged in this initiative and the institutions are the ones that are, you know, sort of experts on what the institutes are doing now, and maybe can help think through how do we monitor that and how do we come into a sort of a more an agreement on what it is that we're counting and what it is that we're measuring in terms of an entire portfolio, not just climate finance.
Okay, thanks, Gaia. A quick question on resilience and adaptation. What appears to be needed by financial institutions to take it into account? Yeah. Well, I only have a minute, I think, to answer the question. So I will just say that I think resilience is really a quite interesting topic. On the one hand, it's extra hard because it's even more difficult to define, because you could have, for example, again, we go back to my solar or wind power plant. That's, you know, it has to do with mitigation. But on the adaptation side, you can have, for example, drip irrigation in one area, and it's not really helping people adapt because they have plenty of water or for whatever reasons. In another area, that's exactly what they need. And so again, you start to get into the difficult questions of how are you monitoring overall portfolio, particularly when it comes to adaptation. On the other hand, adaptation is really simple. It's just making sure that whatever your activities are doing are, you know, have in place plans for the future to come, and that they're based on sound data, and that data is, you know, is reflective of actual scientific trajectories of what's coming. And that also that the projects they're not just built so that they themselves can withstand the future, but also that they don't negatively affect the resilience of people around. So if you have a company, you know, building, for example, a manufacturing site, you want to make sure that that site's going to have enough water and electricity going forward, and also that the communities around will have that as well, so that you're not stealing their water. So I think, you know, those are some of the things that we're exploring at WRI in terms of resilience. Is how do you kind of follow about many of these different tracks? One, just mainstreaming in terms of making sure that everything really is based on sound data, and WRI has a lot of data that it shares in various ways for free, everyone, on water, on forests, etc. And we're just launching, or have recently launched, something called blanking on what it's called, but it's basically bringing together all of our data, Resource Watch, sorry, into one place where you can look at deforestation and water availability, etc., around the world. And then on the other side of adaptation, helping to also look at, okay, what metrics are we actually using to define adaptation, especially also when it comes to things like the GCF and an adaptation fund where they're supposed to be funding adaptation. Well, what is it they need to be funding in that case, and how do you measure that? So. All right, thanks a lot. Well, the speakers have been extremely disciplined, which means we have a bit of time for Q&A, for interaction with the audience. It looks like we don't have roving mics, but there's other... Do we have roving mics or not? All right, excellent. So does anyone have questions? What we'll do is we'll take a number of questions in a row, and the panelists, they can be targeted or very general questions, and then the panelists will answer whichever question they want to answer or not. So if I could ask you to introduce yourselves, first name, last name, and affiliation will be enough, and ask straightforward questions. Stefan.
Yes, hello, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Stefan Bösner from the Stockholm Environment Institute, and I want to rebound on what Gaia was saying. I think we all can agree in this kind of room that new coal power plants are almost always bad for the climate. And I appreciate that now banks have started to mainstream climate consideration into their planning. But I was wondering how banks see this kind of danger of carbon lock-in, where not only coal power plants, but like investing in new infrastructure, gas pipelines, LNG terminals, and how this kind of, if you finance these kind of infrastructures, that would lock in carbon emissions for 10, 20 years to come. And I was wondering where this kind of carbon lock-in consideration is also part of your planning in the banking sector? Thank you.
Thanks. There is another question, right? There is one in the back with a mic already. Please, since you have the mic. There is one behind you.
Yeah, shall I go first?
In the back, yes.
Hello everyone, my name is Niels Hazekamp from both ends, based in Amsterdam. Thank you so much for these very interesting presentations. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on how much fossil fuels already have actually been phased out, divested, how you want to call it. My second question would be if already ECAs, expert credit agencies, are part of your initiative, and if not, if they could be in any way be part of it. And my third question would be, looking at the Paris Agreement, we all know that fossil fuels have to be phased out very soon. And what is for you an end date when you will phase out coal, when you will phase out gas, when you will phase out oil? Thank you.
Thanks. Yes.
Hi, I'm Patrick McCulley from Rainforest Action Network in the US. Question specifically for Mr. James. As the gentleman from the SAI just mentioned, you know, there's a huge amount of coal power being planned right now in the developing countries, about 1,600 new plants that are in the pipeline. And those are almost all in developing countries. And so, you know, to have a policy which just says we're not going to fund them in developed countries where the industry is almost, not quite, but almost comes to a halt, is not very meaningful. So I wonder, when do you see HSBC coming up with a complete exit from financing of coal power? Secondly, related to that is tar sands. So my organization's just come out with a report for the COP on private bank financing of the tar sand sector. HSBC comes out as number 8th largest bank in the world for funding tar sand. So I wonder also when HSBC is going to get out of that sector. Thanks.
Hello, Emily Gerard from Allen's Law Firm in Australia. It's an elaboration probably of Stefan's question, going to supply chains, or more particularly the incentivisation of waste stream, whether that's also assessed carbon inputs into product manufacture and then also product disposal, so life cycle considerations and whether they're factored in. Thanks.
All right, thanks. That's it for the first round of questions. I also have a targeted question for Terry, because I was intrigued, and you stressed the value of engaging on green finance. If you could be a little bit more specific to the audience and say where the EBRD sees value in engaging on green finance, and if it's good for business, that would be most appreciated. Start so that the other panelists can start thinking about the type of answers they would like to bring to the panel, to the audience.
Yeah, no, I mean, really what I would like to do is just come back to the title of the session, right, and the mainstreaming initiative and the principles. You know, the title, The Challenges Ahead for the Systematic Integration of Climate Change Within Financial Institutions. I think this is back to what I was saying earlier about we've got to get the banking sector, the private banking sector, working with their clients to give them financing for energy efficiency, resource efficiency. You know, I'm going to say demand-side energy efficiency. It's not really a terminology that's been used here, but everybody sort of tends to jump and focus on the supply and the infrastructure side of things and the energy side of things. But you know, the biggest sort of area that needs to be unlocked is demand-side energy efficiency. Sort of as an intro to that, you know, when I talk about what's the value to getting more banks engaged, you know, I think, you know, the questions will be answered, but at least you've got banks up here that are already converted. You know, we're at the forefront of thinking about how we change our practices and our business to deliver a green financing component, maybe not for 100%, like AFD said, but for a significant part. And I think we have to be careful here when we want to bring more private sector banks into this mainstreaming initiative. You know, if the first thing that you say to them is, how are you going to account for what you do, you don't really open up the door. So you have to think about what's the opportunity, what's the value that you have to convey to them. And let's not talk about risk, but on the value side of things, it's, well, what are the new products that they can develop and what's the incremental business? what's the value to their clients? You know, does it improve the creditworthiness of the borrowers? Again, it's back to the thing about the internal rate of return. If there's cash flows from the investments as well as something like CO2 emission reductions, it improves the creditworthiness of the counterparties. That's also important to the banks. For the companies, there's all sorts, or individual borrowers, there's all sorts of other co-benefits, right? There's the quality of products produced. I mean, I could give you lots of examples. There's the comfort level in houses. I think what we have seen is at least some evidence that the underlying portfolio of the green financing products that we have through local banks performs better than the portfolio of banks at large. Now, that has to be in part to do with the fact that those customers are more satisfied as well as being more creditworthy. Then, I mean, if just last thing really, there's also, these are sort of questions, but how do we bring more commercial banks in? Is this something that's linked to the climate finance world? As, you know, Pa Ousmane said, you know, they're providing concessional funding and technical assistance to accredited entities. We've got a big program with them that we will roll out to commercial banks. But if we can pull banks into this initiative, and if they adopt these principles and develop a strategy, does this mean that they then are more attractive to the climate finance world and more attractive to the Green Climate Fund? And is that then an incentive to bring them in? The other big agenda, and it'll be talked about all around this event these weeks, is the whole green bond area. Is it something that helps them prepare for, you know, a more streamlined approach to mobilizing capital on the capital markets, but in accordance with the good practice of green bonds? So I think we just have to be very, very clear here that the purpose is pull in more banks. We need to mobilize them. We've got 30-something banks, I think, signed up to the mainstreaming initiative. We don't have enough private sector commercial banks, and we have to think, how do we convince them of the value to them of getting involved and scaling up their business over time? And it's not to sort of give bankers work, right? It's so that they can make loans and distribute and disseminate financing and information and skills that really make a difference on the demand side use of things like energy efficiency.
Okay, thanks, Terry. Anyone on the panel would like to respond questions? Damien?
Yeah, merci. Rather quick answer, because I guess the questions were not directed at me. I'm sorry to take the floor. There was the mention of locking in emissions as you invest in certain technologies or as you finance them. As I was trying to explain earlier, one of the key criteria when we are going to define whether a project is consistent or compatible with long-term transition, the risk of locking in emission is going to be one of the primary criteria on top of everything else. And so we already are trying to some extent to evaluate this, and it's not always easy. It might be easy for a coal power plant. It's not always very easy when you look at transport systems, for example. And I think to complement what was just said, I think we hope to be able to bring more institutions into the initiative. Probably the Climate Summit on the 12th of December is going to be one occasion to attract new members. I think we are missing a few important partners in the initiative at the moment. Probably the export credit agencies are one of a kind, but I would probably would like more than an ECA to attract a big institutional investor like a pension fund or an asset manager of a rather large size. I think this would be terrific, and if it comes from Northern America, even better.
Stuart?
Yeah, thanks. Well, obviously, Stefan, Niels and Patrick all mentioned issues that were addressed to HSBC, certainly relevant for us or indeed any large financier. And I mean, you're quite right, and I take the point that in time we will want to extend the sort of approach that we announced this week for developed countries as far and as widely as we can. That's the direction that we want to go in. But at the same time, you will be aware that there is if you like, a debate, or we live sometimes a little bit in the world of grey, particularly in the poorest developing countries, about the extent to which you can, if you like, deprive them of the ability to move up in their development if they have resources in the ground. And obviously we want to, as a bank, to be involved with them in trying to exploit natural resources as much as possible. But not everybody thinks that you can be as black and white about it in these cases. What we try to do as a bank is to be as forward-leaning as possible, so that if we're involved in investments, that we bring all the sort of knowledge and the standards and the codes that we can bring to it to make exploitation of resources as clean as possible, using the most modern technologies, etc. But also the direction of travel is clear. And last week, just as you mentioned tar sands, some of the team went out to Canada to have discussions there and to really try and understand what more can be done there with that industry to, to bring it into line, to make it part of if you like, the direction that implements COP21. And we will have to make judgments about that depending on how these sort of discussions go. So we don't hide from the question, but we try and be forward-leaning to make investments as clean as possible, and the direction is clear that we want to go in.
All right, Postman, would you like to react?
Thank you. I think the discussion is all premised on Article 2C of the Paris Agreement, which clearly state out that in order for us to move to a paradigm shift of low carbon climate resilient development pathway compatible with 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, we need to ensure that financial flows are consistent with this pathway. And the sooner we make this happen, the better it would be for us, not only from the climate change perspective, but also from the cost efficiency perspective. And the financial sector being the backbone of any country's economy would need to play a very central role in this. And as the GCF, we would be there to collaborate with the financial institutions to see how this could be done at the level of the developing countries. And I think this is our role. We would try to provide incentives so that it would be easier for them to follow this path. And I think as we move forward, we would have more financial institutions joining in the bandwagon, and things would move towards the decarbonization of the economy by the end of the century. But it has to be a gradual process. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Gaia, anything you would like to react on?
No, I mean, not really. I agree that it goes back a bit, I think, to this question of how do you measure whether investments are supporting the future that we want, and that it's sometimes more complicated than initially meets the eye in the sense of what countries will need going forward and what they won't. That includes infrastructure, gas-related and not. And it comes down into many ways to local context, etc. Our analysis of the banks, a working paper that we put out a few weeks ago or months ago, I guess at this point, looking at the World Bank, IFC, and ADB, found that most of the investments in infrastructure and energy fall within this sort of gray area in terms of the relationship to climate. It's, again, transmission and development, distribution, it's natural gas and other such things where it really depends on the context as to whether it's supporting the 2.1C or not.
All right, thanks. One comment from Damien.
Yeah, just maybe just to pick up on the questions that were left unanswered and
You don't have to answer all questions.
No. But I thought I shouldn't. But since nobody else did, maybe I can say a word. The question on phasing out fossil fuel and by what date, it's a very tough one, and it relates back to what Kaya just said. Although we have decided in 2012 to not finance coal anymore, we have still not decided to stop financing natural gas, even though it's really a very small portion of the portfolio. And sometimes I'm almost glad we didn't decide to do so so far, because in certain national contexts, we won't get the renewables we need without putting in some natural gas capacity to balance the grid, and so it's not always clear cut, and the timeline is not always clear cut as well. If you take the example of a emerging economy or a least developed country, I think it's tricky to decide that from our perspective, by 2030 we'll stop. So it's we'd love to. We are just not sure. It's completely one size fits all. And perhaps the question on the waste streams. I'm not sure if I'm going to answer it correctly. It's part of our portfolio that we'd like to develop this idea of circular economy. It's true that I think it's related to energy efficiency or saving resources, saving materials, so the impact is great. And I guess, like for energy efficiency, it's also a very tough business model to sell to bankers sometimes. And I think we have progress to make in this area.
Okay, thanks, Damien. Terry?
Yeah, I'll maybe just say something about supply chains, because I think that's a very, very topical question, and I think it's also linked to the question on the export credit agencies. On two levels, I think the first one is that there's a lot of good standard, well-accredited materials and equipment that isn't available in many countries that we work in. So the whole idea of removing trade barriers to those technologies, identifying what they are, and having some positive way of, I guess, promoting their uptake. I mean, some examples, countries we work in, things like in the process industries where you've got waste heat, well, where you don't have waste heat recovery systems, you know, it's just energy that's sort of going through the roof. So the ability to increase the market penetration of things like waste heat recovery systems that is close to zero in actually most of the countries that we do business in, very, very important. And that has to be done, I think, through some sort of a trade agreement, working also with suppliers of these equipments in countries that make them, and sort of building the connections between the two. This requires banks to step in for letters of credit, credit enhancement, all these sorts of things. The second sort of part of supply chain, and this is all over the place, I mean, we've worked with glass companies and we've got them to work on recycling of glass and setting up the logistics and even setting up business to collect and recycle and reuse the glass so that they can integrate it back into their process. We work a lot with agribusiness companies to use them as a financing mechanism, the same way that banks are important to intermediate funding. I think agri companies can be intermediated in order to reach out to their supply chain. And then the last one, I mean, people talk about biomass a lot, and we've done work in a couple of countries to look at how we can use agricultural residues better. So the problem there is there's never enough of it. You don't know whether it's secure and it's a steady supply. So, you know, investors won't make the capital investments in the plants. So what we've tried to do in two countries is set up a marketplace, and, you know, it's like, if you wanted to give it a polite name, it's like an eBay for biomass. You could give it an impolite name as well, but that's what it is. It's a platform where biomass can be put on the platform and people can bid and take the biomass, and all of a sudden you create the ingredients for a project financing of the biomass industry to take off, and that's also very important. So I think supply chain is very topical. I think we're going to hear more and more and more about that as we go forward.
All right, we'll go for a second very quick round of questions. So I would ask for extremely concise questions and extremely short answers from the panel. Yes, we have 1, 2, and 3. That's it. Thanks.
Robert Gibson, Hong Kong University Science Technology. Question for Gaia. What's WIRI's thought on infrastructure which is linked to carbon-intensive discretionary activities? So luxury hotels where you have to fly a long way to get to them, or cruise liners. You haven't talked about that side of the equation.
Okay, while the mic flows to Nancy, there's a gentleman in the back.
My name is Matthias Larsen. I'm with the International Institute of Green Finance, which is a Chinese think tank working with the Chinese government on greening the financial system in China and internationally. My question is the role of China in putting climate change in international financial institutions. What do you think, how good are their engagement at this point? Multilaterally, AIB, New Development Bank, state-funded, Chinese Development Bank, Exim Bank, Silk Road Fund, and also commercial and Chinese investment banks. Thank you.
Okay, Nancy.
So Nancy Sage from the European Investment Bank in the climate team. We have about 3,000 staff that we need to inform, train, and provide capacity building on climate change. So I'm completely dumbstruck with the thought of trying to do that for 250,000 people. You mentioned high-level leadership and compulsory training, and that is obviously very important, the top-down leadership to the rest of the organization. But to you or to other members of the panel, ideas about how we go from the other way. How do we mobilize, motivate, and really energize staff in a big organization when they have many other challenges to be climate change champions and help with this mainstreaming?
All right, thanks, Nancy. Now, who wants to speak? Less than 1 minute per speaker, please. Gaia?
Well, I think there was a question directed at me, so I can answer that one. I mean, if the question is, what is WRI's stance on infrastructure that supports sort of really a higher carbon future, then that's not necessarily infrastructure that we think would be well placed, right? It's not a good investment. Now, what exactly those high carbon activities are, one also needs to look at the data on that, and whether it's a resort, the degree to which that is high carbon, one would have to look at the context and the information and relative to other potential economic activities there, and what would the trade-off be? Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else?
Yep. Very quickly, ideas for bottom-up motivation. Some things that I've seen tried, sort of Dragon's Den type ideas for the best sort of ways to develop business opportunities and ideas from within the bank. Within the teams, right at the coalface. Bad choice of words, sorry. In order to sort of bring forward new ideas. Other stuff that you're doing in the community, and all large organisations have that. Make sure at least some of that is focused on climate-related activity. And finally, tune in to your families. Most millennials these days are looking in terms of the way they think about their careers, the management of their money, etc. They're very aware of these issues, and I think they too can actually make most of your staff see the world differently. And just finally on China, I think China has been a real key to unlock this debate over the last 5 to 6 years. I know it's driven by political necessity within China and the issues they've had with air pollution, etc. But I think they really are leading in the international community often. And I think in particular, for example, of the, I think it was 9 institutions signed about 18 months ago, a greening the financial system paper that essentially showed how from centrally China was looking at ideas to green the financial system, but also then pushed it down into municipalities, etc., to get everybody on the same page. And that was very idea-rich, which other people have then picked up and followed. So I think they have a key role.
Thanks. Yes, maybe just to echo what's just been said, experience has shown that to keep up the momentum across the staff, you have to really keep on training, keep on recalling the key messages. But I do believe in the also in the existence of a tipping point, largely driven by leadership and also institutional objectives. When the strategy becomes so structuring that everybody has to do their part, and when it's a positive project, let's say. I think it's also a very important driving force through the staff for each to do their part. And on China, I can just completely agree with my colleague on my right. The China Development Bank is actually a member of a club of 23 development banks, which the AFD also belongs to. It's called the International Development Finance Club, the IDFC. And this club was created 6 years ago, so it's a rather young club. And really, the core of the exchanges and cooperation between the members was about the GCF and climate finance, and the CDB. Is really implementing sizable amounts of climate finance domestically and also abroad. So yes, they are big heavyweights.
All right, Terry.
I think on motivation, until you get to the point where green financing's mainstreamed into the activity of a bank, and then maybe it sort of kicks in and people do it because that's what they want to do and what they like to do, and they do it for the worth of the thing. I think, and I can't believe I'm going to say this, but bankers can be a bit mercenary, I think you give them targets until you get to that point and hold them accountable for the targets, and then, just...
All right, thanks. Well, to close the event, I would like to invite Monica Scatasta to come to the podium. Monica is the head of Environment, Climate and Social Policy at the European Investment Bank, and she's representing the EIB's Vice President, Jonathan Taylor. Monica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Benoit, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm really going to try to summarize everything that has been said. It's impossible, but I think we've had really an excellent exchange today. And one of the things I would like to remind us of is the sixth unspoken but highlighted principle at the launch of the five principle 5 years ago, i.e. walk the talk, make it happen. And I think that today's event demonstrates the progress, demonstrates that we've been walking the talk. There's a long road ahead of us, and indeed there are some challenges, but when you give yourself challenging and ambitious objectives, challenges is what you have to face, and that's what we're trying to do together. So trying to draw some conclusions here today. First of all, the big call on all of us to really take a holistic view with regards to climate action and look beyond purely climate finance, the targets that all of us, and as Terry was just saying, we have to put for ourselves, because otherwise the institution is not going to follow, but to ensure that we really have a way to make sure that climate considerations go through everything we do in the institution. And many of you, starting from HSBC, IFD, have talked about the importance of leadership. We've just mentioned the importance of leadership from the top. Indeed, the importance of leadership support for a climate strategy for the institutions is fundamental. But in addition to this, and this is what we saw for the launch of the EIB climate strategy in 2015, in addition to this, what you have to do is bring the whole institution with you, is motivating, is making awareness, is training, and it's actually motivating really the people and providing them with the incentives to make sure that everybody is committed to the objectives of the strategy. And this is what we're experiencing now and what we experienced over the last couple of years with the definition of our climate action plans that really define what everybody, every single service in the bank has to do, not just to develop the pipelines, but to look at climate risk, to look at the risk at project level, at portfolio level, to look even at the footprints in terms of the operation of our buildings. So that's the extent to which we are going. And I think that what we have also heard is the importance of considering when ensuring that this mainstreaming really takes place throughout the institution is to ensure that we consider the multiplicity of objectives that our colleagues are facing, and how do we make sure that the climate action and the climate action objectives are made compatible, or when trade-offs exist, these are understood and in fact made into a narrative that the colleagues can live with and can operate with. So I think that in this sense, really we're all working towards the goal of making all our financial flows compatible and consistent with low carbon and resilience future and pathways. In this sense, the announcement by AFD that in the future, really the selection of projects taking into consideration the compatibility is important. I think that we had a number of questions along these lines coming from the floor, and I think that we have to consider some of the instruments that we have at our disposal. I'm thinking, for instance, with regards to EIB, our our emission performance standards that de facto rule out our support for coal, the incorporation of shadow price of carbon in our economic analysis. There are ways in which we can help make the right decisions. But the issue of compatibility with the pathways, we need to also think of how we can do. We are now asked to do it urgently. We are COP23, COP24. We really have to see a stepping up in terms of ambition, and we need to urgently decarbonize our portfolios because of the long asset lives of what we invest in to a very large extent. We need to urgently address climate risks today and not just wait for the future, as we said, both in terms of our projects and our portfolios. And indeed, we're all grappling with the recommendation of the task force and trying to understand how we can look at the risks for our portfolio. But as WRI reminded us, we need to do this not just quickly, but credibly. And the issue, therefore, of focusing on designing and devising metrics on impacts that we can understand and communicate and credibly measure. The issue also of designing and agreeing on a common language. We've been hearing about climate action finance, then we heard about green finance, we hear about sustainable finance, we hear about portfolios that are in line with the low carbon and resilience pathways, and these all mean different things, and it's important that we are cognizant of that and we find a way to explain the differences in language and speak the same language to a very large extent. Somebody was talking about China's role. Indeed, this issue of building a common language is an area where also EIB has been very active, and I invite you all to an event on Saturday where EIB will be discussing the work that we're doing with the Public Bank of China in identifying and mapping their definition of what constitutes green with the definitions by the MDBs and also the green bond principles. I think this work on languages and metrics is fundamental. Now, we have therefore an enormous challenge ahead of us. We cannot do it alone. The whole objective and logic of today is to do this through partnerships, to do this through shared knowledge. And in this respect, the Climate Action in Financial Institutions initiative is a fundamental step forward, both with regards to the launch of the Climate Mainstreaming Practices database. This is accessible to all. We invite everybody to go on it, and not just financial institutions, by the way. We've talked about the importance of sharing these practices with our clients, not just the financial intermediaries, as EBRD rightly pointed out, the importance of working with the financial intermediaries through which we reach clients, but all our clients. There may be something for everybody in this database. What, therefore, I think it's important to do at the end of this event is to invite others, other financial institutions, but also other institutions in general for which this type of logic might be useful to really join the initiative in terms of the financial institutions, but also go on the database. There may be something for everybody. One thing, indeed, that I also want to underline is something that EBRD also said with regards to the importance, when we speak to others about the importance of mainstreaming, of making clear what the value proposition is, what's in it for them. And there's a lot in taking into consideration some of the aspects that we've just discussed that may make a difference, a positive difference for our clients, of whatever nature they are. So I'm going to stop here. I think there's enormous food for thought in everything that has been said. And the most important point, I think, is that by bringing together private, public entities that share knowledge, have a continued dialogue, and really try to learn from each other. By doing this, and actually probably only by doing this, we can really move the goalpost and finally hope to be able to consider climate change in everything we do. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. And before we thank the panelists, I have 4 announcements for you. To echo what Monica said, if you want to join the initiative, even if you're a large North American pension fund, you can come and talk to Damien, but otherwise you can talk to any member or to the Secretariat, have a look at the website, etc. And that's the first announcement. Second announcement, if you don't know what to do on December 11th and you happen to be in Paris, there will be a mainstreaming event. You are cordially invited to attend. It will be back-to-back with the Climate Finance Day and on the eve of the One Planet Summit. So that's possibly a very nice occasion to spend a weekend in Paris and a couple of working days. Third announcement, in the meantime, don't forget to look at the Climate Mainstreaming Practices database that Felix mentioned. There's almost 50 case studies that have been submitted by financial institutions, so lots of material to look at. And the fourth announcement, if you don't know what to do in the next 10 minutes, I would encourage you to stay here. There's the next side event will be focusing on the role of business in the facilitative dialogue. It will be moderated by Nick Campbell, and it will take place here in 10 minutes. So whether you decide to leave the room or stay here, it's your decision. And now I would like to thank the panelists in all cases, and thank you for your attendance.